Bonsoir et bienvenue à tous et à tous. Ce soir, je suis heureuse d'ouvrir la nouvelle saison des conférences de la Maison de l'Architecture de Genève intitulée Frontières. Aujourd'hui, on a avec nous Ramun du bureau Capaul Blumenthal qui a souhaité venir en personne au pavillon. Et c'est avec grand plaisir que nous nous trouvons dans cet espace pour la première date de ce nouveau cycle. Cependant, je ne peux pas ouvrir les portes du pavillon à notre public en raison des restrictions actuellement en vigueur dans les cantons. Vous ne les voyez pas, mais nous sommes uniquement 5 ici. Ramun, bien évidemment, mon collègue Matej qui fera l'introduction, Fanny, notre administratrice qui recevra vos questions en ligne, notre technicien Anthony et moi-même. C'est loin d'être idéal pour vous, mais autant que pour nous. Nous aimerons vous voir, vous parler, partager de nouveaux verre avec vous à l'issue de nos conférences comme d'habitude, mais à situation exceptionnelle, mesure exceptionnelle. Cette situation inédite est un véritable obstacle pour la Maison de l'Architecture. C'est évident ainsi que pour tous les acteurs culturels des régions touchées par la pandémie, c'est quand même une très grande difficulté de pouvoir aller de l'avant avec nos programmations. Mais nous nous tenons debout et nous résistons, nous réinventons nos formats afin de continuer à défendre la culture du bâti à Genève, en Suisse, et on présente aussi des projets d'ailleurs. Je tiens à souligner ici les soutiens incroyables et fidèles de nos sponsors, donateurs, membres et amis, malgré les circonstances. Et c'est grâce à eux que nous pouvons continuer à être ici aujourd'hui et dans l'avenir. Grâce à eux et à notre public, nous pouvons réaffirmer la place fondamentale de l'art, de l'architecture et de la culture dans le monde et dans l'actualité. Tandis que les technologies nous aident à nous connecter sur des courtes ou des longues distances, la culture nourrit nos mondes intérieurs. Elle nous aspire des solutions nouvelles, des utopies de la dystopie, du rêve de la poésie au milieu des mesures et des ordonnances mises en place face au Covid. C'est justement des frontières dont parle les cycles 2020-2021 de la Maison de l'Architecture. Quand les thèmes étaient sélectionnés par les comités de la Maison de l'Architecture, la pandémie était encore limitée au territoire chinois. Nous ne doutions pas que la situation évoluerait si vite et si fort et qu'elle nous obligerait justement à travailler même dans des frontières nationales et à fermer toute circulation. Mais il existe une multitude de frontières différentes. Nos sociétés évoluent sous certaines d'entre elles. On pense à la différenciation des genres, par exemple, ou encore à la transdisciplinarité artistique. En parallèle, on voit des nouveaux murs s'ériger, géographiques avec les résurgences des souverainetés ou encore économiques à cause d'inégalités croissantes. Les tout sur fond des crises climatiques qui questionnent les destins de l'espèce humaine tout entière. Dans ces contextes, comment construisons-nous dans le respect de nos héritages et des générations futures? Où se niche l'innovation? Ces cycles de conférences cherchera à interroger les frontières, anciennes et nouvelles, réelles ou imaginaires, extérieures et intérieures, et la manière dont chacun s'y confronte. L'AMA convie cette année architectes, ingénieurs, artistes et chercheurs à mettre en évidence les contours de notre monde et à repousser les limites de leur champ d'activité et notre imagination. On aura Olivier Weber le 11 février qui nous parlera de son expérience des frontières en tant que grand reporter et diplomate français. Ronald Rael expliquera plus particulièrement son travail iconique à cheval sous les murs américano-mexicains et la dissolution des frontières entre art et architecture le 25 février. Le 11 mars, c'est à Rui Furtado, ingénieur portugais reconnu, d'exposer son travail, sa recherche d'intégration réussie entre sa formation structuraliste et l'architecture dans un esprit d'innovation constante. Fin mars, c'est à Juliette Foll qu'on donne la parole et qui portera un regard critique sur la géographie politique de l'environnement ainsi que les facteurs essentiels qui déterminent comment et pourquoi la nature et l'espace sont instrumentalisés politiques. Snoetta, le fameux cabinet d'architectes scandinaves, présentera son travail transversal et multidisciplinaire le 6 mai. Et on aura après un nommé photographe genevoise, Christian Lutz, qui lèvera les voiles sous son nouveau ouvrage actuellement en cours, Citizen, le 20 mai, pour une soirée inaugurale ici au pavillon sous le thème du populisme européen. Et encore en juin, Marina Tabassoum nous parlera quant à elle de son travail au Bangladesh, qui vise à établir un langage architectural contemporain et son lien entre histoire et tradition, bien évidemment, de son pays. Je vous invite à découvrir tous les programmes sur notre nouveau site internet www.emma-ge.ch et je laisse la parole à mon collègue Mattei. Merci beaucoup.
Bonsoir à tous. Merci Barbara. Nous sommes très heureux d'accueillir ce soir Ramun Capaul, du bureau Capaul et Blumenthal. Après des études à l'école polytechnique fédérale de Zurich, Gordian Blumenthal et Ramun Capaul, nés tous les deux à la fin des années 60, ouvrent leur bureau dans la vallée grisonne de la Surselva, à Ilanz, pas très loin de Vals, en 2000. Éloignés des centres urbains, à la manière de certains de leurs confrères, ils privilégient une présence locale, permettant l'expression d'une architecture tout en finesse et en sensibilité. Les différents projets qui les ont fait connaître, dont les plus emblématiques sont le cinéma Sil Plaz ou la rénovation de la Turalihus, démontrent une approche particulière, qui en fait un bureau à part dans le paysage contemporain suisse. Si la filiation avec leurs prédécesseurs grisons est bien lisible, Capaul et Blumenthal articulent leur travail autour de plusieurs axes, dans un équilibre subtil. Un respect profond pour le patrimoine existant, exprimé autant dans sa dimension historique que dans la banalité de l'usure d'une pierre ou le noircissement d'un mur, éléments permettant d'éprouver physiquement le passé d'un bâtiment au niveau des sens. Une compréhension et mise en valeur de la matière, toujours locale, dans une approche de plus en plus pure, brute, au plus proche de sa nature, comme l'utilisation de la terre damée, l'argile ou le bois non traité. Une grande rigueur enfin, une radicalité dans l'expression architecturale, implantant les touches contemporaines avec justesse et parcimonie. Outre le plaisir de pouvoir entendre Ramun ce soir parler plus en détail de leur travail, il nous semblait également pertinent de les inviter dans le cadre du cycle Frontières, où nous verrons comment ils jouent avec les limites entre passé et présent, entre local et global, entre tradition et invention. Malgré la situation sanitaire, Ramun a tenu à être présent ce soir et nous l'en remercions chaleureusement. En vous souhaitant une excellente soirée, je lui passe la parole. Merci.
Merci à la Maison d'Architecture, merci Barbara, merci Mattei pour l'invitation, merci Fanny et Lionel pour l'organisation. Quelques mots en romanche, bien ringraziamento per l'invitazione, s'allegro per sta presentare nos projets a Ginevra. I would like to introduce you to some of our projects. We stay pretty close in our region with the projects, and I will show like the projects we developed in our office over the last 20 years, and also reflect and make some observations on the topic of borders in a project-related way and in a wider context. Obviously, there is a close connection between space and border, and as well between time and border. So let's try if this works. So let's start with the first observation, the topography, the formation of the Earth. Surface probably represents the most significant and diverse physical boundaries on Earth. So, yeah. So this is the mountain I see from the place where I live. Depending on the season, the daytime and the weather, it appears closer or it seems more distant, changes its colors, becomes more inviting or hostile. Obviously, the topographical borders form space and allow strong spatial experiences. Perhaps this is the reason why my first encounter with a vertical city seemed so familiar to me. In contrast to the natural landscape, the cultivated landscape stands in an interaction with humans and changes with their way of living and acting. So, throughout several generations until after the middle of the 20th century, the landscape in Graubünden was characterized by small-scale agriculture. The hay was stored near the harvest in barns, where the animals were fed later in the year. Scattered small and tiny parcels of land were marked by boundary stones or by a stone cairn. With the small-scale agriculture, a large number of toponyms of local names served as orientation to the fields. With industrialization, the fields were made accessible by roads, and the hay could from then on be brought to large farms buildings in the village. The stables in the landscape became obsolete, the fields were consolidated into larger parts, and new boundaries were defined. As a result, many local names lost their meaning and disappeared. The landscape became anonymous and lost its spatial density. From the landscape to the settlement. The nucleus of the historical settlement in Val Lumnezia was the farm unit, which normally includes a house, a stable, and a garden. In some small hamlets, which have hardly grown since its origin, the farm units are still recognizable. Here we see such a hamlet in Val Lumnezia. And on the other side of the valley, it's Lumbrijn. Oh, sorry, that's too fast. And also the village structure of Lumbrijn is based on a system of adjoining farms. Today, the fragmentation and mixing of ownership and usage rights make it difficult to recognize the individual farm units with the naked eye. However, the ground plan of the village shows the development of the farm structures. The dissolution and fragmentation of the farm units is related to the gradual densification of the village. Social structures and economic conditions shape human needs and lead to forms of sharing or separation. Eventually, they can define a specific type of building. The architecture heritage in the old village of Lumbrijn, of the whole Val Lumnezia, consists mainly out of wooden buildings in the Strickbauweise of the 18th and 19th century. The most important type of house of that time is the double house, divided in the ridge direction with a traversal corridor. In the 18th century, it was usually built in its classical form, In the 19th century, it underwent many modifications, as you can see in the lower row. What all types had in common, or all houses had in common, was that they shared a common space within the habitation. This is one of the first double houses in its classic form. It was originally occupied by two families who both had their own entrance but shared, oh sorry, this is one of the first double houses in the classic form, originally occupied by two families who both had their own entrance but shared the central corridor. We call it Leurs, that goes from one entrance to the other and separates the two sitting rooms, which usually are orientated towards the valley, from the two kitchens in the northern half of the house. Here the house is turned to the public space, so it's an exception. In the 19th century, variants of the double house evolved, for example, with an addition of a room between or next to the sitting room, to the Stube. Later, more recent examples of the continuing evolution of the double house type date from the first half of the 20th century. The two households are no longer next to each other and share no longer a common space within the habitation. They are divided by being placed on top of another. And the house also have now higher proportions and enlarged windows. So that's history, and that's here it starts when we have to deal with history. This is one of the first projects in our office, the transformation of a double house type from the 18th century into a single house, family house. So in the second half of the 20th century, economic and social changes took place. The families became smaller. People were no more related to each other. The people, maybe the two parties who left in the house, who shared the corridor. So the needs for privacy raised. And as a consequence, the corridor was divided in the middle of the corridor by a wall. The double house type, which had been sustained for centuries, lost a generous shared area, and with it, an important spatial quality. So in this house, since 1960, the two parties of Casa da Meer were those inhabited by, or the house was inhabited by two parties who both now only had a narrow entrance area instead of the shared generous corridor. As many other double houses, undesirable by the younger generation who preferred to build a new house on the edge of the village and sell their parental home. So in 2000, a change of ownership took place, and the house was now to be inhabited by a single family. This allowed to transform, with few interventions, the two-family type house into a single family dwelling by removing the separating wall in the corridor, consolidating the two units and restoring the generous original spatial quality of the house. The two symmetrical external staircases leading to the two entrances were kept, while inside one of the two staircases leads to the bedroom floor and the other to the basement. The rooms that existed twice were put to a new use. One of the two kitchens was converted into an entrance room, and one of the living rooms became a dining room. So this is the view through the traversal corridor from one entrance to the other. And this is the view into the kitchen. And here the upper floor, where the separating wall has also been removed. So the next project is a house we finished last year. And the topic of living under one roof became was here in a different context. In Bonadoz. Bonadoz is located near Chur at 660 meters above sea level, so about 800 meters lower than Lumbrine. In 1908, the village was destroyed by a fire, and the regular building pattern that had been developed after the fire has meanwhile been changed a lot by new buildings. So an existing house with an attached stable was to be replaced by a multi-family house. The question was whether the traditional wooden construction we studied in our valleys, which is familiar in the valleys of the Surselva, is justified in this almost urban context, and how constructive principles and spatial qualities can be developed for a larger house. The new house refers in its three-part disposition to the Strickbau typology. Under one roof there are two houses that share one open staircase. So the open staircase is analog to the central corridor of the historical type. So where the original house was standing, the larger apartment, a 5.5 room apartment, develops over 2 floors and has an internal staircase. On top of this, there is a smaller 1-story apartment. And in place of the smaller stable on the top, a single-family house with 5.5 rooms extends over all 3 floors. So here you see the open staircase that gives access to all apartments and serves as a loggia on the upper floors. And here the corridor here becomes more a passage between the wooden cells inside the private apartment. And here the view into the kitchen. So the next project is an infrastructure building in Val Lumnezia. It allows a regard on the aspect of material and sustainability. In the Vosmons, a leisure infrastructure was developed step by step. At first, the moor landscape, in the natural enclosed landscape, was transformed into an artificial created bathing lake, and later the barn there was converted into a kiosk and wardrobe. In 2012, a competition was launched by the municipality to develop a new infrastructure building with a small cafe. As the Vos Mons is located in agriculture altitude between the villages and the alpine pastures, our project refers to the Mayenzes buildings, the temporarily inhabited buildings in the valley. These vernacular buildings are characterized by their simple, direct and unclad construction. The building material comes from the nearest possible source. So the local availability of materials was crucial for our new building. From an ecological, economical, in the sense of promoting local crafts and know-how. And this is also determined, or this also finally determined the architectural expression. The walls are made of solid wood, the roof of stone. Here, the view below on the roof over the terrace. So while all wood was available in the valley and could also be processed there, the stone for the roof was produced in the neighboring valley of Vals. Here we see how the block of stone is cut before it will be split into slabs. And this is how the building is situated, slightly turned out of the slope. It faces with its main facade south towards the water. With the long facade and its widely overhanging roof, it responds to the facing meadow slopes, creating a spatial center around the lake. The functional separation of wardrobe and restaurant over 2 floors allows separate access directly from the outside. This 2-side access is a feature of the former stables, which were constructed according to topography. Here the overhanging, sheltering roof towards the lake. And here the heart of the building, the Ustrietta, the cafe on the ground floor, with its bare, raw construction walls. The room is reminiscent of the traditional Stuben at the very far end of Valumnetzi on the Mayenzes and in the temporary settlements. So with the next project, we try to examine the border in relation with tradition, with the tradition of burial. Until a few years ago, there were only earth burials on the Catholic cemetery of Lumbrain. At the grave, there was always a cross, but more and more the need for urn burials arose. This is because often relatives are no longer in the village and cannot take care of the grave. So the community organized a small competition for the design of the urn graves. Instead of iron crosses, we proposed shared gravestones with several inscriptions on it. We were aware that it is not self-evident that the change of a centuries-old tradition of grave arrangement would be well accepted immediately by society. The gravestone should therefore convey a sense of community, trust, and confidence. The existence of few white wood stoves in the village gave us the hint that there must exist a local marble resource. In the writings of the geologist de Carvin, we found a confirmation of a local marble occurrence in the valley. So we set off for the high valley above the village. In fact, there we came across a vein of marble with vertically layered stone slabs. In order to make the stones transportable, means less heavy, for the helicopter flight, some of the slabs had to be slightly cut off at the base. Here they are ready for the helicopter transport. So the marble slabs we found had quite the dimension we needed. The question arose, to what extent should we change this natural form that geology had created? At the end, we decided not to change the shape at all, but only to clean the surface from the erosion layer. After a few years of hesitation, the stones were accepted by the population, and the municipality allowed more stones to be flown down to be used in further phases in the cemetery. So we put them together, we took the measurements, and this is a recent model we did in our office to study the selection and positioning of the individual stones for the new urn graves. So the next project is the cinema Sil Plaz, and some thoughts about perception. After the closure of the city's only cinema in the late 80s, the cultural life in Ilans found itself in a bit of a crisis due to the lack of places to socialize. After 20 years without cinema, we formed a group whose response was to find a suitable space for public screenings. Eventually, we found an old abandoned forge where once horses were shot. And there, we held initial film screenings as an experiment. The audience was enthusiastic and supported the club's proposal to turn the forge into a cinema. So we were given the task of creating an auditorium to seat about 50 people and a bar space with a stage for concerts and theater performance in the foyer. The first problem we had to solve was how to reduce the noise coming from the cinema so that it wouldn't disturb neighbors. The more so as the tenant in the apartment just above the screening room had already quit. For the sound insulation, we needed first of all mass, heavy material. However, we did not want to use industrial materials and we tested different methods of using rammed earth as an alternative. Although pisé is not a traditional building material in our region, clay and earth is available as a building material in our region as everywhere else. Furthermore, we were fascinated by the idea of juxtaposing the medium of film with an archaic material such as earth and letting it come together. We then just had the opportunity to present an installation at the Swiss Art Award exhibition in Basel, which conceptually represented the upcoming project. After a first failed attempt, where the wall actually collapsed, Gordian and I finally managed to ram a stable wall out of clay and earth, the one you see here. And on the wall we projected the prologue of Ingmar Bergman's 1966 film Persona. The overlay and superimposition of the projection's digital texture with the grain of the pisé wall gave us an impression of what the atmosphere of the cinema might be like. A film director, it was David Lynch, characterized the ideal cinema as a black box with a big screen and good sound system. But we wanted to create a space that would not lose its presence before, during, or after the film. The walls reflect the light of the projection, and those create an atmosphere. They don't absorb sound as perfectly as in a multiplex cinema, but they make the room suitable for lectures, readings, and music as well. The long restoration period of the Türelihus actually corresponds to the long history of the building. This is an image by Donat Kadoff showing the village of Valendaz in Surselva that differs from neighboring villages such as Flims or Lacs on the other side of the Rhine in many respects. It is in the shade for 2 months, and it is not well known as a tourist destination and has seen a marked population decline in recent decades. Conversely, Valendaz is also characterized by the fact that due to the lack of tourism, a multitude of historical valuable houses have been spared from demolition or over-hasted reconstruction. However, the Türeli house, the house with the prominent tower, which had been built to see and to be seen, and which had characterized Valendaz for generations, had become the problem child not only for the owner, but also for community. The building had stood empty for 60 years and was exposed to creeping decay until, through the initiative of the local population, the Heritage Society took care of it, and our office had a feasibility study drawn up for the revival of the house. Over the years, the erosion of the facade had brought to light fragments of 5 different building periods between 1465 and 1775, which illustrated the complex building history of the house. The first phase of the building dates back to the 15th century and shows a gabled house with 3 floors. Later, the house was given the stair tower and was extended several times. Captivated by the aura that the house exuded in its neglected state, Gordian and I recalled some of the historical buildings that appear to be in new splendor after renovation, but in reality they were robbed of their history and charisma. The longer we looked at the house, the more doubts crept in, and we abandoned our initial idea of tracing the facade renovation back to a single construction phase and reconstructing its missing parts. Instead, we decided to keep visible the existing juxtaposition of the different phases, which in reality were built one after the other, and each one existed on its own. So that's how it looks today. We see a fragment of a gable decoration next to the framing ornament of a later phase. The plaster has only been repaired, but not repainted. So the repairing principle, instead of reconstructing, this principle became the guiding principle, of the restoration of the facade and later also of the interior. Here the elevated entrance on the east facade, where 3 construction phases can be identified. And here the front facade. So the same concept was applied in the interior. We repair parts of wooden paneling, for example in the alcove, and we left them visible. The art historian Ludmila Seifer described this approach as preservational brutalism. And here the view out of the alcove. Here the restored dining room in the 3rd floor. And that's the kitchen, the 1st floor. The smoke black walls have been repaired and cleaned, and we believe they can create an atmosphere of intimacy that is difficult to achieve in a new building. The same in the kitchen, in the 2nd floor. Here we had to close the exit to the pit latrine on the right. So we only left a small window at the seam of the building to prevent that too much light would come in and change the character of the room. This is the bathroom with a lime mortar floor. And this is the stair house. And here one other aspect as to should be mentioned, and this is that the building has 3 different climate zones. The staircase is left unheated, the bedrooms are temperated, and the living rooms are warm with additional wood stoves. So the corridor is completely cold in winter, but it works. So the last aspect, last project. Here we go into the nature, into the Swiss National Park that is located in Graubünden. Switzerland has one national park. The official date of birth of this park was, of course, the 1st of August, 1914. As a protected natural reserve, it began as early as 1909 with a contract between the municipality of Zernetz and the Schweizerische Naturschutzkommission. So it was one of the earliest national parks in Europe, and due to these strict rules, the Swiss National Park is the only park in the Alps which has been categorized as a strict natural reserve with highest protection level. Inside the park, it is not allowed to leave the market path. So in 1910, the Kluze hut was built. It served as accommodation for both the park wardeness and hiking guests, offering 10 beds and 20 simple sleeping places in hay. The following decades, the hut was repeatedly extended. So the Chamana Kluze can only be reached by foot. The walking distance from Zernetz is about 2.5 hours. The refuge is open and managed from mid-June until mid-October. Material and food is supplied by helicopter. Next to the main building, there are a number of outbuildings, the pavilion, the former stable for the mule, a toilet house, and a small washing facility. The Chamana Kluze is largely self-sufficient. The electricity is produced by its own small water turbine, and it has own biological sewage plant. In 2012, a protective dam had to be built to prevent mud flow. In order to improve sleeping and working conditions for staff and guests, the Federal National Park Commission launched an architectural competition. The aim was to find a solution for separating the staff and guests and improve the workflow. So our project extends the existing building ensemble of Chamana Kluze by a 5th outbuilding. You can see it on the top, on the left. And this is the sleeping tower for the staff. The wooden tower is positioned on the hillside of the main building as a freestanding structure. So the vertical proportion of the building and the renouncement of an internal staircase allows a minimum footprint of the building of 5 by 5 meters. Following the steep terrain, the floors are each directly accessible from the outside. 2 corner chambers or cells are inscribed on each floor, which is turned each towards the other. So that's the last picture. By moving the staff to the new sleeping tower. A second dormitory can be set up in the northern wing of the main building. So the guest capacity will remain the same, but they have all more space. It's a capacity of about 60 people. The main building will be gently renovated and gets a new roof made by large singles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramun. Very interesting presentation. Merci à tous pour votre présence. C'est le moment des questions. Vous pouvez donc les poser sur les différents médias sur lesquels vous assistez à la conférence. Moi, j'ai une première question. I have a first question for you, Ramun. I was very intrigued and pleased by the way you try to touch as least as possible the elements, like for the marble stones, for instance. You decided to leave them really like they were. All the turalihus, where as well it had to remain as untouched as possible. Is this an ideal, or where is the boundary between what you leave and what you accept to touch?
I think it has to do with respect for the time. So, because our lives are pretty short, and what geology has created, what erosion has created through centuries, or the black kitchen where people lived for generation, only time can create this aesthetics. So I think it has to do with respect. So before destroying something, to think about what time do we need to do something like this.
Thank you. First question from Julien on YouTube. Ramun, you have presented different types of borders. What border are you more confronted with, and how do you deal with this confrontation?
Which border am I more confronted with? It's difficult to say. I'm glad that I didn't have to choose only one aspect. So I would leave it with all these aspects or observations for the moment. So I can't give a clear answer on this question.
Thanks. Do we have another question? I have another one also, trying to stay on this border theme. You are very much concerned about local material, local traditions, local know-how. How far does it go? Where is, again, the border between what is local and what is further away? Is it physical border, or is it like immaterial border?
Well, if we stay with projects, we did a competition for the embassy, the Swiss embassy in Beijing, and we felt quite comfortable actually in making this proposal, in designing it, and the thoughts were not so different. So about sustainability, using good materials, and actually it was also the task. They mentioned the problems that Beijing has with the environment. So yeah, we won the. I think it was the third place, and of course we were happy with that. But we would also, of course, if you design something, you want to build it, And we think it would have been a contribution. So, I think it has not to do with geographical borders, because what we search for in the local area is also, I think, many arguments are also for our other territories gültig.
Valuable.
Yeah, valuable.
So was this project in Beijing, was it Swiss know-how brought to China, or was it reinterpretation of the Chinese local traditions?
So that was a project where we also talked a lot with Martin Rauch, who is the rammed earth specialist in Europe, and who helped us for the cinema, and to find out how Pisé would work in China, what is the history, and so he was supporting us a lot just with his knowledge. So that was one part. The other part was wood, and wood was maybe what was quite maybe too Swiss in this project, because at the end that was a point that was criticized, that it was not enough representable. So of course we were we have another opinion. So, but in the eyes of the Chinese society. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Do we have other questions? Barbara, Fanny? No? In that case, I thank you very much. Merci beaucoup pour votre présence. J'ai appris qu'il y avait passé 70 personnes qui suivaient la conférence. Ça nous fait très plaisir. Thank you very much, Ramun. It was a pleasure. And once again, thank you for coming all the way to Geneva. Merci à tous, à toutes, en vous souhaitant une bonne suite et à très bientôt pour la prochaine conférence de la Maison de l'Architecture.